Hi, welcome to session two of the first topic of the semester, Indigenous Peoples of the Americas and Texas. So, what we're going to be doing in this session is continuing our discussion on the indigenous peoples of the Americas and Texas from the place that we actually left in the previous session, in session one, and that is that in session one, um, we were actually providing a general overview of the indigenous peoples of the Americas in terms of their statistical numbers, 80 million to 120 million people that inhabited the Americas at the time of the contact with the Europeans, and settling in different conditions and environments of the continent, therefore creating different cultures in the process. We were also paying attention to the origins of uh, the indigenous peoples of the Americas according to the diffusion theory. So again, this is a theory that I discussed very fully in terms of how scholars propose that Native Americans came from the old world, that is to say, the older and the oldest continents of the planet where humanity started, starting from Africa, and then, of course, out of Africa, the diffusion of human populations across the globe in the span of millions and millions of years, and making their way, many of those groups, into the Americas through the Bering Strait, the crossing again of the Bering Strait, the land bridge, the landmass that connected Asia and America, particularly 40,000 years ago, the last ice age. There was a massive outpouring of peoples into the Americas through the Bering Strait, and we discussed that fully. We were also looking at the stages of development. This is the second segment again of this topic that we started in the first session, we're going to be looking at the different stages of development that Native Americans peoples, or the indigenous peoples of the Americas, will be going through from 40,000 BC onwards. And there will be specific stages of development across thousands and thousands of years as those peoples are dispersing across the continent from the migrations that occurred during the Ice Age about 40,000 years ago or so. And many of those groups are going to be moving into different areas of the continent and settling and adapting to different conditions. And in this process, as we're going to be looking at, is that they're going to be creating different types of cultures, different types of social institutions, different types of technologies, if you will, or tools that will enable them, of course, to survive better in the environment. And in that process, of course, they're going to create eventually certain civilizations that we're going to actually pay attention to in this particular segment, in this particular session. Okay, so we started talking about the Stone Age. This is the first stage of development. We started that in our first session at the very end, talking about how during the Stone Age, which was not only, again, happening in the Americas, but this was also a global age as well, a world age. Most human populations were living in those same conditions, similar conditions, and going through similar experiences, by the way. So this was not just unique to the Native American peoples or the indigenous peoples of the Americas, but again, this was pretty much something that occurred worldwide. Um, so during the Stone Age, which was an age in which humans created certain types of tools that enabled them to survive in their environment made from stone, that therefore, again, the term given to specific world age refers to the type of technologies that people use or crafted for their survival. During this time, again, it was really, again, a time in which people were hunters and gatherers and surviving in the environment, from moving from place to place, chasing the source of food. Again, the food supplied wild animals that moved from place to place and migrated from place to place. Again, and so humans pretty much follow very closely the animals that they hunted, and of course crafted certain tools that enabled them to hunt much better. Again, the animals. Um, so again, we were talking about how it was primarily an animal protein diet that they survived on, but also in addition to that, the gathering of edible plants that women, of course, were in charge of, and so on and so forth. And we were towards the end talking about also some of the initial beliefs. Again, the first religion that was crafted during that time, that was formulated by early humans in the Stone Age, was animism. The idea that the world is animated by spirits, that everything in nature is, animated or endowed with a spiritual entity and force, and that this is the worldview, again, the religious worldview that is going to serve as the basis or foundation for all the other beliefs that Native Americans are going to formulate. Okay, so now, having said that, now let me then now shift to the outlines, so we can continue then. Just checking here, double checking. Okay, so we can continue then um, our um, our discussion on this very first topic. What I do in every segment, in every session that I start, is pretty much give you an overview of what we covered in the previous session. That way, you ground your attention again in the material that we have covered, and of course what we're gonna cover next. So again, so the first world view, the first religious worldview of hunters and gatherers in the Stone Age was one based in animism, as I said. Everything animated, everything possessed or endowed with spirits, everything, the elements, the forces of nature, everything was moved by a spirit. Now, from that worldview, we're going to see the emergence of religious cults. In other words, the beginning of religious practices or rituals that the Stone Age peoples are practicing, and they're going to become very, very fundamental to the Native American way of life, and how they're going to think about the world, and how they're going to later on create their more complex religious ceremonies. Okay, so Native American religious thought can be traced back to this period of time when, in the Stone Age, we're going to see the emergence of the first rituals that people are performing that provided meaning, of course, to their existence, and they considered to be fundamental, again, to their survival. In their religious practices, or the religious cults, were centered in the worshiping of animals, because animals were the source of nourishment, because animals sustain human life. Therefore, Stone Age peoples, the indigenous peoples, as well as virtually all of the human beings living on the face of the earth during this time, because this was a global age, by the way. There were also hunters and gatherers. The conclusion was that of everything in existence that they experienced and encountered, the most important, the most sacred were the animals, because without the animals, humans would not exist. So it was a sort of simple conclusion for them to think of animals as sacred, and indeed to think of them as gods. They were animated by spirits, but those spirits that lived inside of the animals were not ordinary. They were
superior to all the other spirits of nature, and just because human survival depended upon the animals. So this is very important when we study religions, world religions, and that is whenever there's an element or a force, an aspect of nature that becomes so essential for the survival of a group, that is force or element, etc., that feature of the landscape, etc., will become sacred, okay, and it will be worshipped as something sacred, either as a god, etc. So it is very important. So back then, animals became gods. Okay, they were revered and worshipped as gods, and most of the rituals that people performed during that time were devoted to worship animals. They are the first gods of humanity, that is to say. So again, I'm just going to pretty much give you a breakdown, a very quick survey of the most important rituals and some of the important also beliefs that this religious cult, this animal religious cult, actually exhibited. We can actually go back and study it. There's remnants, of course, that are available to us that it aid us to actually see and understand again the world and the worldview of Native American peoples living during those times. So, first and foremost, the first rituals that we can trace in human history that Native Americans are practicing, by the way, during the Stone Age, as well as other peoples of the world, are hunting rituals and Thanksgiving rituals. Those were the first ones, presumably. I mean, this is what we can actually know and reconstruct. And the reason for that is that since animals were considered to be gods, therefore, it was important to actually ask permission to the animal god to be sacrificed whenever people needed nourishment. They will go out into the fields to look for an animal, but what those peoples understood is that in order to really have success in this endeavor, it was essential to actually tap or connect with the animal god and the animal gods, by the way, in order to communicate with them and tell them that it was very important for people to eat, to live, and so therefore they needed the god to be sacrificed. So they started performing hunting rituals. That is to say, before the hunting expedition, there will be a ceremony in which people began to invoke through, chants or prayers and dances and so on, the animal god, to ask permission to that god to come to people in order to render its body in a kind of ritual sacrifice. So the first hunting rituals begin. So the hunting ritual is performed prior to the expedition, perhaps for a day or several days, and then once the hunting ritual is performed, then one can go into the fields in search for the god. And even the hunting expedition itself became a religious activity. It was not just an expedition in a practical sense, in that you're just looking for food, etc., but rather this was a ritual. You're about to meet a god, and the god has been called upon. So very soon you're going to encounter a god, and the god is going to pretty much be sacrificed ritually. That is to say, so the expedition itself was a religious activity, and then after the animal was sacrificed, a Thanksgiving ceremony had to be performed almost immediately. Okay, and giving thanks to the god and so on and so forth, and people believed that that was essential. Okay, they really created a sacred, concept here of involving the hunting expedition became sacred. The animals are sacred, and those rituals were essential for people to actually have any success. And then ingesting the flesh of the god by the people was also considered to be a magical act, in that the powers of the animal were also becoming part of the people. That the people were ingesting, of course, the flesh of a god. So therefore, by ingesting the flesh of the god, they were acquiring certain magical abilities, magical powers, and they were, in a certain sense, acquiring the identity of the animal itself. Okay, so this is very important. How very early on Native American groups are going to start developing those ideas. And again, this is very important to understand fully indigenous groups in the Americas and everywhere. Okay, virtually everywhere in the Americas. This is not something that only specific groups are going through and experiencing and formulating, but rather this is pretty much universal. And there's also, again, beliefs about guardian spirits, that all human beings really are born with guardian spirits, and those guardian spirits are animals that guide the life and the destiny of a person, and everybody has a different guardian spirit. And also the belief began to emerge during the Stone Age, sometime in the Stone Age, that certain individuals could indeed have the capacity, particularly the shamans, the religious guides, those that are the ones performing the hunting rituals, the Thanksgiving ceremonies, that those individuals could indeed take on the form of their guardian spirit, that they could shapeshift. It's a metamorphosis, in other words, that they could indeed merge with the animal guardian spirit, so the animal guardian spirit can shift the shape of the human body into an animal form. So again, those were very, very, very early types of ideas among native groups, but all over the world there are similar ideas and legends and myths that we still can recollect regarding animal shapeshifting. Humans are shapeshifting into animals. That is to say that this is not just unique to Native Americans, but rather this is something that we can also see elsewhere, like in Africa. Again, there's legends about people transforming into birds or panthers. In Europe, the werewolf, legend, and so on and so forth. We think that those as simply children's stories or legends, but they really go back in time, okay, to the Stone Age, and that people were very connected to the animal world, and we're going to see that connection being thought of as humans actually turning into animals. Specific humans, by the way, not everybody. So again, you can still find, again, those ideas of this shape-shifting, for example, still present in the Americas in many traditional communities, in that people are convinced that without a doubt that certain individuals, the healers or the witch doctors and so on, etc., that live in the community, that they can indeed transform themselves into owls, etc., or birds, so on and so forth, of various kinds. So those are still surviving in the present day, and those are beliefs that still survive in the present day. So, at any rate, so in these animal cults that are arriving in the Stone Age, it took thousands and thousands of years, by the way, for those ideas, those practices to take form, but they are taking form during the Stone Age, by the way. We're also going to see the very first rituals performed towards animals, worshipping animals as ancestors, or they call that animal totem cults. That is to say, Native Americans are worship animals as their totem. And what a totem is a totem is any plant or object. No, I'm sorry, any plant or animal, by the way, that is considered to be the ancestor of a group. So totem and ancestor are pretty much the same concept. Okay, but the totem, when we mention the word totem, we're actually indicating that there's a group of people that worship a specific species of plants or animals as their ancestors. So totem and ancestor is the same thing. Okay, it's really the same thing. But in the context that we're actually looking at here, in the indigenous peoples of the Americas, again, it's pretty much the something that refers to, in this case, animals. So during this time, there's going to be many groups that are going to develop this notion that the group itself originated back to an animal god, an animal, ancestor, that is to say. Because the animals were so important to their survival, they're not just going to be thought of as gods that needed to be worshipped in terms of their hunting rituals and Thanksgiving rituals, but rather that because without certain species of animals, a certain group of people is not going to survive in the environment. They thought of those animal species as completely 100% essential for their survival. So therefore they said those specific species of animals are our creators, they're our ancestors. When the world came into being, those animals were the founders of humanity. Okay, so animals founded humanity, they created humanity, and they created the different groups of humanity, that is to say. So we're going to see a lot of rituals and ceremonies in which the Native American groups are now worshiping specific species of animals that were important because either they provided the nourishment, in other words, they were the animals that they hunted on a daily basis that provided the sustenance for their survival, or there were certain species of animals that were guides to their survival. In other words, those were animals that help a specific group of people survive because they migrated to areas that were safe in different seasons, and because they followed certain animals during those migrations, those animals serve as guides. So therefore, they believed that since the guidance that those animals provided was so essential for their survival, therefore those had to be their creators. Like for example, eagles. Eagles migrate according to the seasons to areas that are warm during the winter times of the north, and then they go back during summertime and so on and so forth. They migrate from time to time, seeking bodies of water and so on. So those are species of animals that provided very good guidance for people to be moving from place to safe areas and where the resources were located. So therefore, they turned those animals into their own creators, their own ancestors, and they become the totem of the clan. So the totem is the symbol. This is the animal that represents really our ancestor, our creator, as a group, that is to say, the animal totem. Think of it as a flag, for example. Okay, now we use flags, and flags represent the symbol of a group. So the group says, well, okay, this flag reminds us that all of the members of this group share a common experience, we share common history, we share a common past, but most importantly, we share a common ancestor. And that's exactly what those people were referring to, is that the animal itself was like the flag, like the symbol of the group, in which it brought people together as a common identity, under a common identity. That is to say, those were the symbols of the group identity. That is to say, and so people could indeed bond with each other and could bring people together for a common cause, for a common purpose. That is to say, so we're going to see the formation of clans all over the Americas, in which each clan is going to have its own animal totem, its own symbol of ancestry, that they said we all go back to that animal. That is the creator of the group. Okay, so it's important to remind people that, look, this is, where we come from, and this is providing meaning and identity to the group, so the group can actually work together. That is to say, so again, all over the Americas, we're going to see the development of those animal totems and the formation of clans, each identifying with different species of animals, like bears, for example, the bear clan. There's also the wolf clan, for example, the beaver clans, buffalo, deer, and so on. There's just so many different animal species scattered across the Americas. There's the eagle clan again as well, the hawk clan, and so on and so forth. There's just a wide array of different animal species, some of which people live off of, like the buffalo and the deer. They actually is permitted to kill the totem, the ancestor. Of course, you require the rituals to do so, but other animal species are forbidden to be hunted just because they're considered to be extremely useful and essential for their survival as guidance. So it's prohibited to actually hunt those animal species. But nonetheless, people really believe that those animal species are their ancestors. And whenever they appear to people, people are convinced that those animals are actually past ancestors. In many cases, they believe that they're the relatives that they already passed away. In many cases, they manifest themselves in those animals to guide people. So they're not just animals in the practical sense, but they're also believed to be the spirits of relatives and ancestors and family members that passed away, that choose that particular animal species to appear before people in order to guide them. Okay, instruct them and so on and so forth. Sometimes tell you which are the medicinal plants that you need to take from the environment. They're convinced that this is going on, again, as they seed them in the landscape. That is to say, so this is extremely important. This is a religious cult that will remain throughout thousands and thousands of years. We see the development of an animal religious cult that has so many different features, and people are very connected to this kingdom, the animal kingdom, so much so that even their identity is derived from the animal kingdom. In many cases, individuals bear the names of animals. Children are given the names of different types of animals that are part of the totem cult. The ancestor cult, that is the animal ancestor cult, and people are given, again, names like standing bear or white wolf or white eagle and so on and so forth. People take the names of animals. Now, at some point, also, the animal totem cult, the worshipping of animals as ancestors, is going to take the form of worshiping figurines. In other words, Native Americans are going to carve figurines made from wood, some from rocks or clay, and those are considered, again, their own ancestors, by the way. So they, for example, they create a figurine in the form of a deer, because the deer is the emblem, the symbol, the representation of the clan. They're the deer clan, for example. They see the deer as their own ancestors or creators. So what the Native Americans are going to do is not just worship the object of that they're carving and they're creating, but rather they are going to elaborate certain ideas that are fundamental to this type of religious cult, the animal religious cult, in that they're going to develop the idea that they could indeed transfer the soul of the deer, which is considered to be their ancestor, to transfer the soul of the deer from the deer itself onto this carved figurine. Okay? So the belief centered on the notion that the blood was the transmitter of the soul. So if you spill the blood of a deer onto an object like a figurine through some form of ritual act, and I call that animal sacrifice, by the way, that indeed by transferring or spilling the blood, letting the blood of the deer, and pretty much covering this object on the blood of the deer through some form of animal sacrifice, they believe that the soul of that deer was transferring to this object, and you're now spell binding the soul or the spirit of the deer onto this figurine, so it becomes enchanted. So this figurine is not just a piece of rock or clay or wood, but rather it has become enchanted. It has a spell-bound spirit, okay? And the spirit is the spirit of the deer. And the deer is the creator god and ancestor of the clan. Why do that? Well, because if you're able to do that, they believe, then therefore the god stays with you. So instead of the god living in the wilderness in the form of deer, you can bring the god to live with you as close as possible, and this god is living now inside, is spellbound in that figurine. And so with that, you can create many benefits for you, the person that actually holds the object, but also for the clan. The clan is now protected by that deer god. Okay, the deer god becomes the protector, the overseer, if you will, of the clan, and so is going to make sure that the clan survives. Okay, he's going to protect them. That's the belief. That's the belief again among natives. And so that god has mana, has force that could also be used as well to ward off, other people, to ward off spirits that are not very, helpful. Someone might be evil spirits and so on that are in the landscape and so on and so forth. So it becomes an object of power, that is to say. Those are the first stone gods that historians and archaeologists are able to recover from the very first religions that appeared with early humans. So this is the first object that people crafted, that people worshipped. Again, because before this time, it was only the worshipping of the environment, it was the worshipping of those animals, if you will, but now people are bringing those spirits to them in the form, again, of this, creating this figurine, carving it, keeping it, amongst themselves in order to empower the clan. Storing animal spirits again, and those objects where the spirits are stored, those figurines, are not just ordinary objects. They're objects of power. Okay, so this is extremely significant because because number one, as I mentioned, this is going to be the very first object that humans are crafting and worshipping. Okay, and they're putting them on certain shrines, if you will, and so on and so forth. in conferring, offerings and so on. But the most significant aspect of the emergence of the stone gods, those animal figurines that people actually worship as their ancestor, by the way. So it's not just an object of power. People see that the ancestor lives now with them and people worship them. And it serves to bring people together, by the way. By worshiping this figurine, it brings all the members of the clan together, because that's the common ancestor. But what's also significant here is that the emergence of those stone gods in history signal also the beginning of certain changes and transformation happening among human groups. And that is that the emergence of stone gods signaled the beginning of what's called hierarchy. Hierarchy is any society that has a ranked systems, rank groups, in which some groups find themselves subordinated to others. So, in other words, the emergence of leaders, that is to say. So, prior to this time, presumably what happened is that the members of those groups during the Stone Age shared equal status, okay, prior to the stone gods, that is to say. People were pretty much equal. They had equal decision, abilities to decide for themselves. They shared resources equally, and so on and so forth. Decision making was also part of a group activity. But what the emergence of the first stone gods indicate is that we're going to see the emergence of leaders, and leaders that have special status in society, a status that is more important, more special, more privileged than the rest of the group. So they have a special ranking, in other words, that puts them on top, in other words, of people. Because if we're going to see the first objects of power, okay, appearing in human societies, like the stone gods, that means that whoever crafted that object, whoever crafted the figurine, whoever performed the ritual to spellbind the animal spirit onto the object, and whoever keeps that particular object is not an ordinary person, because that person created an object that is considered magical. That person had specialized knowledge, ritual knowledge, to be able to transfer the spirit of a god, considered to be the creator and ancestor of the group, onto an object. So that specialized knowledge is very rare. Only certain individuals have them. That was, the idea of the age. And so that person is very knowledgeable, and that knowledge enabled them to store power in an object that they possess and guard. And so by guarding that stone god, then therefore transform them into persons of power. Okay, they have a special connection to the ancestor. They communicate with them. They guard. They perhaps the messengers. They're the ones that actually transmit the messages given to them by the stone god to the people. So he is in the middle of the ancestor and the community, if you will, or the group. Okay, so people see that that person therefore has power. He's the guardian of power, and as that person dies, he's going to pass on that object onto somebody else, and so power is being transferred from generation to generation and kept and maintained in a specific institution, if you will. In other words, there's going to be a group of people that are going to inherit a position of authority. And so therefore, again, we're going to see the emergence of a hierarchical type of society in which we're going to see now leaders, in other words. So again, the stone gods were just revealing to to us that societies were changing, and there's the emergence of actual leaders. And, there were leaders that guide people, make decisions, and so on. And they're also going to be conducting the rituals. And of course, this is just again very quick snapshots of the different stone gods in North America. For example, the wolf totem, the wolf ancestor. For example, this is a figurine, recovered from North American societies, groups, the animal jaguar ancestor from central Mexico. There was also the idea that the jaguar was the ancestor of the rulers. So the rulers also crafted animals that were the rulers of nature, the rulers of the jungle, like the jaguar, and they were worshipped by the rulers. So extremely important, again, that those figurines are revealing the emergence of leadership, actual, established, legitimate leadership in rulers among those societies. Another jaguar ancestor also uncovered in southeast Mexico, the Yucatan, for example, peninsula. We see that, of course. So it's very important that those were not just figurines that people crafted to remind them of their gods, but they saw them as animated. They saw them as endowed with a spiritual being, an animal, which they considered their ancestor, the totem, the ancestor of a specific clan or group of people, that is to say, or the leaders, if you will. So what we can actually reconstruct from the Stone Age is that during this age, we're going to see the emergence of certain sacred symbols that are going to be the foundation of Native American religious thought. And this is the way they're building a worldview in which nature appears in a specific way, is animated, but certain spaces of nature are very, very important, very sacred, like caves. Caves are sacred because this is the place not only of protection where they dwell, they use us for shelter, but also for ritual. Many of the rituals they perform, like the hunting rituals and Thanksgiving rituals, many of them initiated in the caves because this is where the people actually stayed, and there were the first temples, like the first churches, okay, of humanity. And of course the indigenous peoples of America was no exception. As a matter of fact, the caves continue to this very present day to be sacred openings of the earth, sacred spaces among many Native American groups. And of course the mountain were also, of course, seen as sacred because the mountain was part of this larger complex of the caves. Many caves were situated within mountains. So the mountain itself was part of this sacred environment from which the cave emerged. So therefore, Native Americans during this time are also going to see mountains as religious temples. But they perform rituals on top of mountains, and they believe that mountains were stairway to heaven. You can actually tap into the divine by moving into the mountain, top of the mountain, and so on. Still, a lot of mountains being revered as sacred among Native American groups all over the Americas. And animals, okay? So there's no doubt. Animals during this time were all sacred. Many of them were worshipped as gods, but also as ancestors and ancestors of the clan, and they pretty much worship them in many forms I just explained. So at any rate, the Stone Age, I really wanted to elaborate as fully as possible on this age, even though it really goes back thousands and thousands of years in time. But this is extremely important for understanding later on Native American societies, because Without that, we're not going to understand the rituals. For example, why they perform rituals in certain spaces like caves or mountains, why many of them perform animal rituals, hunting rituals, why certain animals were considered to be sacred and they were revered as gods, like the buffalo, for example, in North America, is really important. So that's why I really wanted to present a more in-depth analytical view, again, of this development. That way, we're connecting the dots as we're going to be moving forward in history. Is going to be very clear as to why certain groups behave in a specific manner and so on and so forth. All right, so now let me elaborate on the second stage of historical development, and that is the horticultural age that occurred between 8000 BC all the way to 3500 BC. This is the second stage that occurred after the Stone Age. And again, during this stage, what scientists, geologists, archaeologists suggest is that after the Stone Age, which spanned roughly between 40,000 to 8000 BC, came a different world age in which many human groups around the earth are going to change their way of life, abandoning the way of life of the past of moving from place to place, wandering, chasing food and so on, and now changing their way of life in terms of settling and creating nested communities in specific locations, and creating what today we just simply called the village setting, villages in other words. So the life of the nomads for a lot of people is going to start changing around 8000 BC, and many people are going to simply start settling now and beginning an age called the horticultural age, or the age of horticulture, which in very general terms, what this indicates is that humans are going to develop a new strategy for survival that is not going to depend exclusively on hunting, but rather that we're moving into the early stages of farming. So instead of just relying on animal protein for sustenance, that humans are going to discover for the first time in history how to actually reproduce plants from scratch, how to reproduce new plants so they can actually grow certain plants that were very nourishing in specific locations, and supplementing now the diet that was still in use back then of fishing and hunting. But whenever fishing and hunting will fail, again, humans are going to simply rely now more on the products of the land. And horticulture was really the beginning of farming. It's not yet large-scale agriculture, so it's not agriculture. So horticulture is like the kindergarten stage of agriculture, where we're going to see the formation of the first gardens, okay? Gardening, okay? The domestication of wild plants and trees is going to take place during this time. And according to geologists and scientists and so on, this transition was possible due to the fact that during this time, 8000 BC, there was a severe drought that affected the entire globe, okay? That it was prolonged. It kept going for decade after decade, and many of the large wild beasts that existed back then began to reduce in numbers, and many of them actually die off. Okay, so many of the large animals that people hunted back then became extinct. So people had to develop then an alternative strategy for survival that it was not going to depend on hunting exclusively. So again, we're going to see the transition then to the early farming stages, and women were the ones responsible for this, because women were the gatherers of edible plants during the Stone Age. They were the ones going out into the fields, gathering edible plants and fruits and so on, berries, vegetables that would just simply pick up from the ground. And in this process, after thousands and thousands of years, around 8,000, enough knowledge was accumulated for women to understand how to grow a new plant. Again, to take a seed from a plant, to plant it in the good soil and nourish it with water, and oxygen was essential, and sunlight, and of course to plant it in the proper season, like spring, for example. The timing was also, very, very important. And so enough knowledge was accumulated for women in this case to know exactly how to start reproducing those plants that provided the most nourishment for them. And for Native Americans, those wild plants that began to be domesticated were actually corn, beans, and squash. The holy trinity of the Native American diet. From this time onwards, the Native American diet will be based for many communities, villages, and eventually the civilizations that they're going to build. They sustain themselves primarily from those three staples, from those three crops. Again, corn, beans, and squash. Those were wild plants that existed in the wild. They will feed off of them, for thousands of years. But by 8,000, they're taking them from the wild and bringing it to a space in which they're going to create a garden, and they're going to water it, of course, and maintain those gardens in order to pretty much grow their own food. So the early stages of farming begins around this time. So it's a slow process. The transition was slow, it was gradual, but it was very steady. By the way, the experimentation with this process of adapting plants from one environment to the other, and again experimenting year after year after year, and of course getting better and better, more knowledgeable in the process. Of course, they also domesticated other vegetables, chilies, for example, tomatoes, potatoes as well. Various medicinal plants and herbs are going to be also nurtured in those gardens, and those gardens are going to simply change the way of life of people, because now, instead of moving from place to place, people are going to choose a location to actually settle and still conduct certain hunting activities, fishing, so on. But whenever hunting and fishing fails, you have another reliable source of nourishment from the garden, that is to say, that is giving you products year round. So again, this is the beginning of what's called sedentary societies. Again, sedentary societies, and a sedentary society is a society that is stationary, that is not moving per se. So we see the formation of nested villages, and many native groups, the vast majority, I should say, form villages based on kinship, familial connections. People have a familial connection with one another based on birth or marriage, and they see themselves as an extended family, if you will. So this is going to become the basis of the type of organization, the social organization among Native American societies, that we're going to see the emergence of kin groups based on kinship, extended family groups, if you will, all across Americas as they entered the village life, the village way of life. Now, in this transition, it's important to understand also that the religion is going to change and become a little bit more abstract. The religion among the indigenous peoples that are making this transition into the village way of life are going to develop a religion based on the worshiping of the Earth Mother, because as they transition into this new way of life, the people that are settling there are beginning to develop, for example, language. They live in close proximity with one another, and so they are able to associate certain words and sounds and vibrations with certain ideas, and they're beginning to, as the year pass and their socialization continues, they're going to pretty much structure a language that is going to pretty much provide a more rich, more profound meaning to their existence, and create a religion that is going to be a little bit more abstract and more all-encompassing in this process. And that is that they're now thinking that since everything comes from the earth, plants come from the earth, trees come from the earth, medicinal plants, the water that is so essential comes from the earth, the animals and so on. So everything comes out of the earth. Therefore, the earth is now the grand, supreme being from which everything comes. So while still some people continue to worship the animals, that continues to be very important among the hunters and gatherers that stay in that way of life. Among those that now live in communities and villages, those peoples are beginning to elaborate now a more profound way of looking at life. And they see that, look, everything is born out of the earth. So the earth must be feminine. It must be a mother, because just like life comes out of, from women, of course, they give birth, of course. Therefore, the earth is also producing life. Just like a mother produces life, the earth is also producing life. Every year there's new products. Every year there's vegetation, there's food, there's fish, etc. There's animals. So there's abundance, of course, that every year is born out of the womb of the mother, which is the earth itself. So they're beginning to see and worship the earth as the supreme being, and is worshipped as a mother figure, in other words. Okay, and so therefore it was essential for the mother to be giving life all the time, in other words, to be fertile. So most of their rituals, most of their ceremonies are going to be devoted towards fertility, to increase the fertility of the mother, so the mother can provide all the nourishment year after year after year, all the time. Okay, so this is very important. Most of the rituals are going to be fertility rituals from now on, and this is something that the sedentary societies, the villagers, are going to practice year round. Almost every ritual that they practice was a fertility ritual. A fertility ritual for the land, so it can produce more vegetables, more plants, more medicine. Or if you want to go fish, okay, you want to do rituals at the lake or in the river, so you can increase productivity. Or you want to do rituals in the forest, so you can increase more the animal species, the wildlife there, so on and so forth. Okay, so all of the rituals are going to be fertility rituals, and the religion is going to be a feminine religion. It's a goddess religion, the religions of the goddess. When people thought of the supreme being, of the divine, they thought in feminine terms, not in masculine. So it's very important. During this age, the age of agriculture, this was a female-dominated world in every area of life you can think of. Like religion, for example. The religion was feminine. People worshipped the mother as a goddess, and all of the rituals were devoted to make the goddess more fertile, if you will, for the sustenance of life on earth, particularly for humans in this case, virtually. So another area, again, in which you see the transformation of human societies towards a more feminine-dominated world was, again, in that all of the leaders of society, from the family, again, to the community, were women. Women were the head of the household. They were the head of the village. of the villages, and also there were the spiritual guides, the ritual specialists, the doctors, the scientists, the people of knowledge were all pretty much feminine. The shamans were female, and again, they conducted the ceremonies for fertility. There were the priestesses, again, that conducted all of the rituals I just mentioned. There were the doctors that knew about medicine, the plants that healed, many of the ailments that people suffered, attending pregnant women at the moment of birth, childbirth, for example, and so on and so forth. So again, this was a female-dominated world. It's very important because for 5,000 years, this is an era in world history that not only Native Americans are experiencing this type of society, but virtually all human societies are going through the same experience during the horticultural age. And the reason for that is because women were the ones that made this leap forward possible from the Stone Age to the horticultural age. They were the women of knowledge. They knew about medicine, they knew about plants, they created the first gardens, and so on. So, therefore, they were honored, they were revered by people as very special beings, that had a lot of power, a lot of knowledge, by the way. Okay, so during this time, the horticultural symbols that we can rescue, just like the Stone Age symbols based on caves, mountains, and animals, during this time, most of those symbols were centered on the symbol of the tree of life, or the world tree, or the sacred tree. Because now people understand that plants, the plant kingdom, is sacred because they provide sustenance, they sustain life for humans in the form of medicine and in the form of nourishment. Just like before, in the Stone Age, people thought of animals as gods because without the animals, people will die. But now, humans living in those times, in those villages, are coming to the conclusion that without the product of the land, without those vegetables and plants and trees, humans will simply not live in this type of setting. They will be thrown back to the Stone Age. They'll be chasing animals. So they believed that there was something beneficial now, that had changed, in that they had a different way of life. They had language now. They had, some form of social organization, leaders that were very well established with their systems of knowledge. And they believed that thanks to the tree, thanks to the plant kingdom, this leap of forward was made possible. So therefore, the trees had to be sacred. And there's imagery of the sacred tree or the tree of life virtually everywhere around the world. Okay, and the tree was worshipped again as the symbol of the earth, the symbol of life, in which life begins in the very bottom of the tree. This is where the seed was planted underneath the earth. This is where all springs, all life begins from the womb of the earth, from the inner levels of the earth upward. And again, they believe that all the souls, all the spirits that are alive today are resting there. It's called the underworld. They come back to the natural world to live as humans. They live as animals. They live as plants for a while, only to return back to the womb of the earth after death. However, there are certain individuals that are able to make their journey upward, and they become perfect, they said, and they become special and powerful and knowledgeable and wise, and they ascend to the third level of the tree, which for them was considered to be the upper portion of the tree, the stems reaching all the way in the branches of the tree, reaching all the way to the sky, the heavens, that is to say. So this is the purpose again of humans living on earth, is that our purpose is to move towards the upper worlds again, and this continuous process of living from lifetime to lifetime, recycling ourselves on the earth, until one day we're going to reach the heavens. Again, those are motifs that were developed during this time. For that matter, we're going to see the beginning of burial practices and ceremonies in which people are beginning to bury their dead in certain locations like cemeteries, burial sites, sometimes inside of their homes, in their village space, because just like life comes from the underworld, all the souls come from below. They believe that after death, the body of the person that just died has to be returned to the earth so the soul can find its journey into the underworld. So again, we're going to see the formation of those burial practices and ceremonies, and of course the idea of cyclical time, that time is cyclical, that life is cyclical, that goes in cycles, and we call that reincarnation, because the earth is doing that all the time. Every year there's 4 seasons that tells us about the cycle of life. Life is born in spring, blossoms in summer, it withers in the fall, dies in winter, only to be born again in spring. So life is continuous, is eternal, it never dies, is recycling over and over again. So Native American thought was also very deeply rooted in the idea of reincarnation, because again of this idea of the world tree again, and nature. Okay, now let us move rather rapidly here, and it's about 15 more minutes. It's enough to enter the agricultural age. This is the age of agriculture that begins in 3500 BC in world history. This is the official date, by the way, that historians propose when agriculture actually began, even though it actually started in different places at the same time, perhaps with certain variations in terms of the specific timing, if you will. But the transition towards agriculture in world history is going to take place around 3500 BC. And this is the age that followed after the horticultural age that we just covered. So this is extremely important. I'm going to just put this up in this following page, because this is the age that brought about all of the major civilizations of the world, not only in the Americas, but virtually everywhere that we're going to see the rise of civilizations. And most of those civilizations emerged along certain river systems. That's why they're called the river civilizations, because what humans are doing now in the agricultural age is moving towards large bodies of water, river systems again, in order to build irrigation systems diverting water from a river in order to start growing crops on a grand scale. Okay, so instead of just keeping gardens and living in small villages numbering from 500 people to maybe 1,000 people, now people are going to increase productivity in the land. Again, it's extracting the maximum amount of crops from the land by simply tapping into those resources that were very essential for the reproduction of crops, and that is water. So instead of relying on the blessings of nature every year on rain, people are simply now going to start moving towards those rivers, and by doing so, building small canals or irrigation systems diverting water of those rivers in order to bring water to their fields. And now we're going to see hundreds and hundreds of acres being prepared for agricultural production. So agriculture is really mass production of the land. So that's the difference between horticulture and agriculture, in that horticulture is just early farming or gardening, but agriculture is going to be large-scale production, again, large-scale farming with the construction of irrigation systems. Again, so we're going to see the beginning of the Chinese civilization, the civilization of India, in the Indian subcontinent, in Mesopotamia, the Middle East, in Egypt, the beginning of Egyptian civilization, and in the Americas, we're going to see the emergence of the civilizations of Middle America or Mesoamerica, like the Olmecs, the Mayas, the Toltecs, and in South America, in the Incas. So we're in now shifting to a whole new way of life that is not going to be based on a village form of livelihood, but rather we're going to be moving towards the stage of city life. That's where civilization, the word civilization comes from, is life in the city. Okay, the growth of big cities again that are going to arise as a result of people being able to produce more food, to extract more and more products, more crops from the land, and be able to feed more and more people. And we're going to see now thousands of people living in the same space as opposed to just a few hundred like back in the horticultural period in the villages. Now we're going to be looking at severe and significant, very dramatic social and cultural transformations. So let me explain those transformations one by one, so you can gain a sense of the kind of changes that transpired with the coming of agriculture. So, first and foremost, what happened in the Americas was that we're going to see the expansion of corn-based agriculture. This was the crop that was chosen by Native Americans to be the primary source of nourishment for the building of their civilizations, or the big cities that are going to house tens of thousands of people. Okay, corn is a very important staple. It's considered to be complete in almost every sense of the word, in that it has all the nutrients, all the minerals, all the vitamins essential for sustaining life. It has carbohydrates, plenty of them, by the way, to provide energy for work, and also has certain key proteins and amino acids for building muscle. I mean, we're not really talking about the kind of amino acids that animal protein can give you, but it's enough, again, to actually provide everything that a human being needs, not only to live and survive, but to thrive, again, to build a whole civilization. Corn, beans, and squash. Primarily it's corn, but it's supplemented, with beans that also provide essential nutrients like fiber, iron, and protein, and also squash. Pretty much everywhere in the Americas, from Canada all the way to South America, that people are making this transition towards agriculture. Those three staples are the ones that are being used. There's wide varieties of them in order to build the different cities that existed during the beginning stages of agriculture during this time, and the advanced civilizations, by the way. Now in China, of course, and in places like Asia, there's going to be different plants, different grains, like for example rice and wheat. In Africa, there's going to be things like millet, for example. In the Middle East, it was wheat. So there's different plants that are pretty much providing the sustenance to different groups in the rise of the great civilizations. So this is one of the first very important transformation taking place, is that we see the expansion of corn-based agriculture and the Holy Trinity, of course, corn, beans, and squash becoming the fundamental in the diets of Native American groups. Demographic growth that leads to the demographic growth, meaning population growth, Villages are growing from 1,000 people to tens of thousands. I mean, some cities um, in central Mexico and in Central America are going to house up to 80,000 people, just a single city. Again, so there's just the overwhelming increase of human populations pretty much all over the world, and they're living now again in cities, in crowded areas. Of course, early urbanism, that's exactly number three, what I'm actually referring to. Early urbanism is that more and more human societies are changing their way of life in that they're now dwelling in urban areas. Urban means cities. They're moving there and they're accommodating to a whole new way of life, away from the village. In the village, remember, you knew everybody, you were connected in familial connections with the community. But as people are moving to the urban setting, you're not going to be necessarily connected to all the people that live there in terms of kinship, in terms of familial connections, that is to say. So this is a change, a social change that is taking place. There will be certain ideas that the group goes back in time and share a common history. So there's a sense of community, of course, by the city dwellers, in that people see themselves connected in a historical past, if you will, but kinship is beginning to be modified, if you will. The idea of kin groups, extended families, if you will, from the village, as they're now living in urban areas. Number four, another very significant change taking place is that now in the life of the city, people are going to start developing the advanced systems of knowledge. In fact, this is the beginning, this is one of the features of civilizations. The rise of civilizations signal also the rise of the advanced systems of knowledge. The beginning of writing, for example, is not just formal structured languages that are on the rise, that have been developing earlier in the horticultural age, but those writings are now represented by symbols, letters, and so on, numbers, and they form a writing system. And that writing system is used to write down all the knowledge that has been accumulated for thousands of years. People are writing their memories of their historical experiences, of the knowledge that they have inherited from the people that lived before them. They write it, of course, and they start now creating what's called science. Okay, and among natives, we're going to see different forms of symbols that are going to be used to create, for example, mathematical systems of knowledge, particularly among people that live in central Mexico and Central America. We're going to see advanced mathematics. A system of mathematics is on the rise, particularly in central Mexico. Astronomy, the observation of celestial bodies, the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planets, and then marking the cycles of those movements in terms of calendars. There will be over 30 different types of calendars that indigenous peoples are going to formulate that follow very closely the passages of celestial bodies that were important for them, because people believed that whatever happened in the heavens had an effect on earth in terms of agriculture, in terms of building a new temple, when to conduct ceremonies, when to go hunting, when to go fishing. There were specific timings that people had to follow that were beneficial. The timing aided the activities that people carried out, and there were other times that did not aid those activities. So again, for them, it was important to be paying attention to the sky and to know the calendars in order to actually carry out virtually every activity. When to get married, when to go out and trade if you were a merchant, and so on. Again, this is the kind of specialization that we see calendar crafting, calendar making, formulation of calendars, cycles of times, and so on and so forth. In architecture, again, the building, of course, of temples and public works. That's exactly leading us, of course, to number 5. Public works and monumental agriculture is, visible in the Americas in different areas where civilizations are on the rise. Pyramids are really temples to house the gods and carry out, rituals there. Canals, diverting water of the rivers to water crops, building of roads for trade, to carry out certain pilgrimages and rituals from temple to temple and so on. This is taking place in different areas of the Americas wherever there is agriculture being developed. By the way, there's tens of thousands of people living there, so there's going to be a lot of people, commissioned to work in different endeavors, in different, again, areas to build the cities. Some of them are building roads, canals, temples, public buildings, and so on, so forth. And most of the cities, by the way, that were built in the Americas were actually ceremonial centers. They were to be used for religious purposes. Most of the cities, by the way, they were housing gods, pyramids, and housing gods, and people actually perform rituals there as well across the Americas. Number 6, another important transformation in the rise of civilizations is, again, the rise of divine kingship, divine kings. In other words, the rulers of old are now becoming divine figures, many of whom claim special connections to the gods, and they become kings that people worship as gods, divine kings. The institution of kingship in all of the states of those civilizations, every city that was built and governed by a king was a theocratic state. What is a theocratic state? It's a state in which the political ruler is at the same time a religious figure. Okay, so the merging of church and state, that is to say, the king was the supreme priest, if you will, of the realm, and he at the same time was the king. Okay, so he was the messenger of the gods, he was the spokesperson of the gods, and so on, because they claimed ancestry back to the important gods of the sky, like the sun and the planet Venus, for example. Okay, that people consider to be the brightest sky in the firmament, again, at night. The sun, of course, and the planet Venus, the morning star, for example. Okay, so this is very important. During this time, we're going to see the emergence of kings governing the cities, and they govern as religious figures, by the way. The religious system is complex, becoming far more complex in that new gods and goddesses that are introduced, like the sun god, the moon goddess, the rain god. The earth continues to become, continues to be worshipped as sacred and a mother, and of course, and also the corn god, because without corn, there's no civilization. So they also formulated, of course, a belief in the corn god, and it becomes part of this larger and larger religious system, again, in which there's a lot of deities involved, many of whom played a key role in the production of agriculture, and corn agriculture. Whether you talk about the sun, the moon, rain, the earth, and corn, they're all of them without exception, agricultural gods and goddesses, many of which people believed are really extensions of the 4 elements. Okay, so among many of those advanced civilizations of the Americas, what we're going to see is that the symbol that really represented all of the gods of agriculture were the symbol of the 4 elements, the sacred cross. Because whether you're talking about the sun, the moon, the earth, the rain, all of them are made of the 4 elements. And they represented the 4 elements in the form of a cross. So the cross was already sacred for Native Americans before the arrival of the Europeans, because every aspect of the cross represented either fire, water, earth, and wind. And together, those are the elements of creation. Okay? And they worship them because they believe that in the beginning of time, when the world was created, the gods, the first gods that created the world were the four elements. And those four gods transformed themselves into creation to form everything. Okay? Without life, without the four elements, there's no life. Take away heat or fire, you take away water, you take away the earth, or you take away wind or oxygen, there's no life. So they understood that as like a scientific, understanding of what sustained life, again, in general. So they were very, very important. We're going to actually just place a stop here. We have reached our time that we have to actually stop. But when we come back in session 3, we're going to just survey in very general terms the most advanced civilizations. We're not going to spend more than 10 minutes talking about the Olmecs, the Mayas, the Toltecs, and then we're going to just shift in our third session to the North American indigenous peoples of North America. Just understanding the major groupings and, of course, looking at the peoples of Texas very closely. So, again, in the third session, we're just going to really discuss very briefly the highly advanced civilizations of the Americas, and then look at North America itself, and then focused on the societies, the groups that settled in Texas. Now that you know the basis from the Stone Age to the horticultural and agricultural, we're just going to, again, survey the major groups that arrived into Texas, where they settled, looking at some of their features and some of the changes that those societies went through after 900 AD all the way to 1492. All of that will be covered in the third session, but for now, our session has come to an end, and we're going to pick up here precisely when we come back in session 3.